Yes, sir. Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Gemara class. Tonight, I want to begin with saying a l'chaim, chaim l'bracha. Firstly, I want to dedicate tonight's learning to the speedy recovery and the healing of Chaim Baruch Eliezer ben Rasa Esther. And Neshama, may he have a complete and speedy recovery. So l'chaim. And also, tonight is Rosh Chodesh Kislev, beginning of a new month. It's the beginning of a festive month where we're concluding the month which is called Mar Cheshvan, which is a bitter month. The reason it's called a bitter month is because there's no festivals in the month of Cheshvan. It's the only month with no festivals at all. So we go from Mar Cheshvan, the bitter month of Cheshvan, Kislev, which has the festive holiday of Hanukkah in it, and in the Hasidic calendar there's Hasidic holidays. So it is a festive month, but in the Chabad Hasidic calendar, Rosh Chodesh Kislev has an added component to it, and that's because in 1977, on Shmini Atzeres, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that at that point 75 years old, had a double heart attack on Shmini Atzeres in 1977, and it was very clearly life-threatening. And they somehow turned his office space in 770 into like an ICU unit. They brought all the machinery. And there he recovered for about 5 weeks, and he left the hospital, which was his office, left his hospital room on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, which symbolized his recovery. So for Chabad Chassidim, it was always a day of gratitude and celebration, celebrating the recovery of the Rebbe after his double heart attack. So again, L'chaim should be a month of festivity, a month of healing, and a month of celebration. L'chaim. So today's topic, I'm going to go between two Gemaras. And the topic is honesty. And are we supposed to be honest or not? So the simple answer is, I see you already shaking your head. Not sure. We can debate it. You know, we can vote on if honesty is a good thing or a bad thing. Generally speaking, honesty is an essential part of Judaism. Honesty is the best policy. Is it always the best policy? That's the discussion today, except when it's not. But I do want to point out one way in which Judaism has a more radical, but more severe approach to honesty than maybe most people do. Because there is an approach out there that suggests that honesty is only important, or for that matter, a lie is only wrong when it's harmful. And the question is there anything wrong with a harmless lie? Is there something wrong with a harmless lie? That's the question. Let me give a basic example. So suppose someone is, someone sits next to you in the airplane and they ask you, how old are you? And for whatever reason, maybe you want to say you're younger than you are. They ask you how old you are. And instead of saying you're 50, you say you're 40 or whatever. Instead of 60, say you're 50. A few minutes later, they get off the airplane and go on with their lives. But for that few moments, you were dishonest. You gave off a younger age than you were. But seemingly, it didn't affect anyone. There was no harm done. So is there anything wrong with a lie in a circumstance which is no harm done? And if the answer is yes, why? What's the problem?
Well, if you get the benefit of the feeling good, then there is a benefit.
So it's benefit. Not only that moment I felt good. This person sees me in a certain light. I have I'm not hurting anybody. So it's even a good thing. I feel good. What's that?
But you have to remember the story.
That's right. In case next time you're sitting back in the airplane with that same person.
Like a good spy, you have to tell me.
Right. You can't, I don't know, you sound a little too familiar with this. So is there a problem with that? So some would suggest no. In other words, in a utilitarian approach, basically says that as long as it's not harmful to others, then it's fine. But Judaism disagrees with that. Now, some would say there is a philosophy out there, putting aside religion, that says it's not good. And the reason it's not good is because one thing leads to another. If you become accustomed to lying in a harmless situation, it'll eventually lead to lying in harmful situations. And there's many harmful situations of dishonesty. So there is an approach that says dishonesty, even if it's harmless, is negative because it may lead to harmful dishonesty. That's one approach. But Judaism says, no, it's not because of what it's going to lead to. Dishonesty, sheker, is wrong even for that situation which seems to be harmless. And that's because we believe that one of the divine characteristics, one of the characteristics of God is truth. And God is the ultimate truth. The Rambam says, and this is kind of abstract, it's the ultimate truth because the definition of truth is that which doesn't change. And God is the only entity which doesn't change. God, Haya, Hova, V'yia, was, is, will be, the only unchanging and therefore most essentially truthful entity on earth is God. And therefore, once we establish that God is truth, so when a person is dishonest, it is an ungodly characteristic. One is doing the opposite of what God is, even if it's harmless, even if it doesn't seem to be hurting anyone. But that moment sitting in the airplane in which you lie about your age, which doesn't affect anyone, but yes, it does, because that moment one is doing something which is the opposite of the godly characteristic. And we're supposed to emulate our Creator. So in that sense, a lie is not only wrong because it may harm someone or may harm me, even if it is harmless, it is still wrong. But then we are brought back to our question, is there ever a time when it is okay to lie? Now that we've established that even a harmless lie is still wrong according to Torah, so then is there a circumstance in which lying is okay? Or as we're going to point out today, is there ever a time where lying is a mitzvah? Is it ever a mitzvah to lie? That's, what's that? When it threatens your existence, okay? So then you're saying that only this situation in which it would be a mitzvah to lie is when I have to save my life. And we have this general principle that you violate all of Torah to save your life. But even in those circumstances, we say you violate the Torah to save your life. So it is a violation, but you're doing it. You have to do it. But I don't know if it's categorized as a mitzvah. It's what you have to do.
It's just like the story of that who was that in the jail that they couldn't put the film because they had the
Right.
smell.
Correct.
The mitzvah right now is not to put on the film.
Okay.
No.
All right.
The
So you know what?
mitzvah.
Fair. One example would be, and that's an example which applies to all areas of Torah, that if it's a matter of life and death, other than the three sins of idolatry, adultery, and murder, you're supposed to violate the Torah instead of giving up your life.
That would be your
Okay,
mitzvah.
so that's one. Okay, very good. Is there any other circumstance which is not life-threatening in which it would be a mitzvah to lie? Shalom bayis. Okay. Right. So that gives leniency to a lot of anytime, basically for the peace in the home. It's a mitzvah to lie. So in marriage, just continue doing mitzvahs.
It's no wrong, it's no right answer to that. Also, another.
What's
If you say no, you will.
There's no answer to that.
they say about the husband. I'll say this about the husband. The husband wakes up and looking in the mirror and says, I feel terrible about myself. I put on weight. I've got wrinkles. My hair is thinning. And he says to his wife, could you say something nice about me? And she says, well, at least your eyesight is good. So don't try that at
I
home.
think there's another, if you're a lawyer.
If you're a lawyer, then it's a mitzvah to lie.
Well, you're a
I don't know. I'm
lawyer.
asking. The question is, when would it be a mitzvah to
That's
lie?
your job.
That's your
I
job.
mean, some of them.
Okay. Hashem said something which seems to be somewhat dishonest in order to give the shalom bayit. Okay, we're gonna get to that a little bit.
Well,
So kind of like that situation where you have one person, like two parties, and they're both disagreeing with each other, and you say, oh, this person wants to get along with you, make up. Oh, this person, and you go to the other party, so they want to get along, and then.
Right, they make up
Obviously
to that.
lying, neither one of them said that, but you're.
So to make peace. So that's shalom bayit, but not just shalom bayit. It's shalom between people. So it's a mitzvah perhaps to lie for the sake of shalom. It's funny you mentioned about about lawyers and lying. So I think I once remember hearing that maybe it was Benjamin Franklin who used, at one point he was a soldier in the U.S. Army, but then later, and as he got older, he was once asked to be a politician, to serve as an American politician in a foreign country. And he said, the nice thing is, when I was a soldier, I was told I have to die for my country. Now that I'm a politician, I just have to lie for my country. Slight change. All right. So let's get to several Gemaras. We're talking about why am I bringing this up today? Because I usually connect the Talmud to something of the weekly Torah portion. And the weekly Torah portion this week includes, as does many of the Torah portions in the book of Bereshit, some element of dishonesty or deception. Torah portion of Toldos includes at least one very obvious, some less obvious, but one very obvious example of dishonesty. And what is that? Not the selling of what?
Okay, so whatever.
Not the selling is
the blessing.
the blessing. Where is the dishonesty that Esav calls his son, Yitzchak calls his son Esav and says, go hunt animals for me and bring them back and make food and then I'll bless you. Rivka hears about this. And Rivka says to her son Yaakov, I want you to get the blessing. Yaakov says, but Yitzchak's giving it to Esav. She says, no, you should do it. He says, but my father, Yitzchak, who's blind, even if I come to him, what if he comes and he feels to make sure that I'm the right person? So she says, here, I'll give you some of Esav's garments, which are with me in my house. You'll wear that, and then you'll get the blessing. That's what he does. So he goes, he prepares the food. Rivka prepares the food, and then he brings it to Esav, Yitzchak. What's the first thing Yitzchak asks is, who are you? And what does he answer? Anochi, Esav Echarecha. I am your firstborn son Esav. That seems to be a pretty straight up dishonesty. And this you see throughout the different sections of the books of Torah. There seems to be a lot of deception and dishonesty going on. So how is Yaakov allowed to do that? So I don't even know if our Gemaras are going to answer that question. But we see dishonesty exists in the Torah, and not just from wicked people. We see, as Eli brought up earlier, we see some level of dishonesty even from God. So when would dishonesty or deception be permitted? So we'll start with Gemara Ksubos, Daf Tes Zayin, the very last line of Tes Zayin Amud Beis, 16b, the very last line in Ksubos. And over here we have a discussion, a disagreement between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel on the topic of honesty. Says the Gemara, Tan Rabban, on our sages taught, Keitzad meraktin lifnei hakala. Some of you may be familiar with those words because it was turned into a song or several different tunes to those words. Keitzad meraktin lifnei hakala. How do you dance in front of the kala? Now he's not asking how do you dance. You do the waltz, did you do the kazatska? That's not the question. The question, as Rashi says, is Ma omrim lefaneha. What should be said when you dance in front of the kala? There's the bride and the groom, they're sitting together, it's often the case. Bride and groom sit together during the wedding, and we dance in front of them.
Just dishonest, it's a little bit dishonest of Rashi to do this question, that question.
How so?
Because that's the translation.
I understand, but he's explaining what the question is, based on the answer. The part of, so how do you dance, which means, what are you supposed to say? Well done. So he says, Beis Shammai Omrim, Beis Shammai says, now, apparently, in the old days, there was, until today, there is a common compliment that's given to the kala, and that is kala na'eh v'chasuda. The bride is beautiful, and chasuda is, Rashi says, what's chasuda? Chut shel chesed mashuch aleha. She has a streak of kindness, of goodness to her. Kala na'eh v'chasuda. She's beautiful, and she has a streak of kindness to her. That was the common song sung. But Beis Shammai says you can't sing that if it's not true. Standing there in front of the kala, what if you don't think so? What if you don't think she's beautiful? What if you don't think she has that chut shel chesed, that string of kindness? So now what? So this is where it comes to the question of honesty or dishonesty. Or in this situation, you don't have to say anything. You can just dance. The music plays, and you just, I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to be dishonest. So that's, Beis Shammai says, what should you do? Kala kamo shehi. You have to compliment her or sing words of compliment, which are truthful. You cannot sing words of praise which you don't believe because it's dishonest. Rashi says, kamo shehi. Says Rashi, Lifi yofya v'chashivusa mekalsino. So you have to give praise which is in honest accordance with her beauty and her integrity. And you cannot say beyond that. Now that's Rashi's understanding of what Beis Shammai is saying. Tosfos says something a little bit different. Tosfos says, Kal kamoshihi, praise her as she is. And therefore if she has a physical defect, yishtaku, then don't talk about it. Then don't mention beauty, because that's clearly not her strength. Don't praise her in an area that is not her strength. Inami, alternatively, try to find something that is beautiful, try to find some sort of quality and focus on that. This can go now, beautiful eyes. In other words, find something specific which is truthful and highlight that and celebrate or praise her for that. Beis Hillel says no. Beis Hillel says to every bride, you should sing and say the words, Kala Noava Chasuda, this is a beautiful and righteous bride. You may not distinguish and edit for a bride who you don't think fits those qualities. Beis Hillel says, don't nitpick and try to find qualities. The bride will know right away that you are, you are deviating from the common song and praise that is given. It'll be highly offensive, even though you are complimenting, what beautiful shoes or something, even though you're giving a compliment, but that compliment will be seen as very offensive. Therefore, you have to compliment her. Beis Hillel says you are obligated to sing a dishonest song to this bride. So Amar Lam Beis Shammai to Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai said to Beis Hillel, what if she has some very clear physical defects? Can you really say Kala Nava Chasuda? Can you really say the bride is beautiful when it's clearly not the case? The Torah Amra says Beis Shammai to Beis Hillel. The Torah says Midvar Sheker Tercha, distance yourself from dishonesty. So how could you? Of course you want to say something nice and you want to feel good, but the Torah says distance yourself from dishonesty. Beis Shammai is saying, I'm not saying you should offend her, you should say something insensitive, but that you certainly don't have to say something which is false. To which Beis Hillel responds, Amar Lahem Beis Hillel Beis Shammai. So Beis Hillel said to Beis Shammai, Lidivreichem, according to your words, Misha Lakach Mekach Ramin Hashuk, if someone purchased something from the marketplace, and you look at it and you say, this is a bad deal. They bought a lemon. Yishavchenu be'enu, should you compliment the purchaser, or yiganenu be'enu? Or should you degrade the person who bought it? He bought it already. It's one thing if they came to you before and said, should I buy this item or not? Then you could say, I don't think so. They bought it. They have it now. And they come to you. Should you degrade them, or should you say, very nice? Just say very nice.
Look at the return policy.
Look at the return policy. Not very good return policies back in Babylonia. Havi Omer, Rachel says it seems clear that you should compliment. You should praise the item. And therefore he says the same is true. That even though it is true that the Torah says Midvar Sheker Tercha, it's interesting that he doesn't really answer Beis Shammai's point. Beis Shammai says the Torah says Midvar Sheker Tercha. Distance yourself from dishonesty. And Beis Hillel never really addresses that. He just gives another analogy to kind of prove his point, but he doesn't really address the question. Yes.
Isn't there something about the bride and groom or day or something like that?
Yeah, it says so. What's that?
Isn't that some type of glory, so to say?
Yeah, it does say the bride and groom are compared to Melech and Malcha, king and a queen.
So even if she wasn't pretty, she'd still have kingship, so to say, that day, which means it's still something to be beautiful.
Right.
Not just beautiful, but it doesn't have to be beauty, so to say.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
So there are some who explain that Beis Hillel is saying, but Beis Hillel's opinion is that the truth is over here, there isn't dishonesty, because the fact of the matter is that even if I, who's dancing, doesn't see the beauty, but clearly the one who's marrying her does. So beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And therefore, when I'm saying that this person is beautiful, what I could be saying is beautiful, and it takes the special eye to see that. And the groom who's marrying her certainly sees that. Or chasuda, the same is true not only about physical beauty, but the second issue, which is a chut shel chesed, the goodness which is extended upon her, the same thing. Anyways, mikan amru chachamim. From here, the sages taught, from this disagreement, the sages taught, la'olam teheidaita shel adam me'ureves im habrios. A person should always try to be sweet or properly blended among the minds of others. It's important to try to be good to people. We're not just talking about reves and habrios. I'm interested in how he translates over here.
Can we agree that it's a person should be always
Pleasant. You should work to be pleasant in the eyes of others. That's the best way to saying. Even though it's not a mitzvah, is it a mitzvah to be a pleasant person? Is it how he translates those words? So it doesn't mean a politician. A person's disposition should always be empathetic with mankind and treat everyone courteously. There's an idea, aside for charity, aside for doing mitzvahs, that you should be pleasant in the eyes of others. And Rashi explains what that means. La'asos le'ish v'ish kirtzono. Try to do to people what they want done. Try saying to them what they want to hear.
No, I said
There is, so you say the extreme of that is a people pleaser. What's the opposite of a people pleaser? That I don't care about people. No, as long as I'm not hurting someone, then it doesn't matter, right? As long as I'm not hurting another person, I'm okay. The sages say no, that's not okay. The attitude is if I'm not hurting other people, then I'm a decent person. That's not the attitude we should strive for. You should try to give people or to tell people things which are going to make them happy. Not because I hope to gain something in return. The people pleaser, the concept of a people pleaser, is often there because I need something back. I want something. That's not the reason. If that's the motivation, then it's wrong. But just for the fact that if you can make someone happy by saying something, say it.
But that's kind of doing them a disservice if you just tell people what they want to hear. So if you don't point out their real strength and
there's many circumstances in which this idea doesn't fit in. But generally speaking, a person, just like this argument between Hillel and Shammai, Hillel says better to say something a little bit dishonest. But this way, the bride and groom will feel happy about themselves than Beis Shammai's approach, which is much more, which seems to be in line with the verse from the Torah. Midvar Sheker Tircha seems to be absolutely in line with Torah. Nevertheless, the halacha follows Beis Hillel. Then in this situation, a person should be dishonest instead of in any way causing shame or embarrassment to a bride and groom. So the first example in which we say it's a mitzvah to be dishonest is not shalom bayis. This is not the category of shalom bayis. This is avoiding shame. If this dishonesty is if the being honest right now will cause someone significant shame, and what's the benefit? It's not like this being honest over here has a benefit. There's some situations we have to be honest because I have to tell you about the problem. That's what's interesting about this example. It's not an example in which by being honest, you're going to help them solve the problem. It's not a problem. This bride may not have those qualities. But by being honest, you're not going to help them. There's no positive outcome to being honest with it. So therefore, in this situation, it's a mitzvah to be dishonest to avoid shaming someone. And then the question is, what situations can we apply that to in which it's better to be dishonest and not cause shame than to be honest and cause shame, or even to be quiet and cause shame? And that's the novelty here. Beis Shammai is saying, don't be honest, don't offend anybody, just don't say anything. But if I know that by not saying anything, it's going to be embarrassing, then say something, even if it is somewhat dishonest, and therefore avoid shaming this person.
Why don't we take the example of the transaction?
Which transaction?
Somebody made a lemon, he bought a lemon.
Yeah.
Then we can take this example for So it's like, if I'm gonna tell them that it's wrong, I should put them to shame. So why would I?
One second. Let me just find this word that I'm looking for. Okay.
The example of the lemon is saying that you can compliment. You don't say that the lemon is a bad grape. You don't tell him.
If he's not gonna get insulted, maybe you can.
I
tell
think
him, but
the
if he will get
general,
insulted,
I think the rule we can understand over here is that if honesty serves no benefit, just the only benefit is that I'm being honest, but it also causes shame. So then certainly you shouldn't say something. You don't have to say it, but sometimes even not saying something is itself the indication of what you believe. If someone shows you a piece of artwork they bought, they're not returning it. And they say, is it nice? If you don't answer, you're basically saying what you think. And therefore, in that situation, to say yes, it's nice is causing them not to be embarrassed, because if you don't say anything and they just spend $10,000 on it, so it's hurtful. You hurt their feelings if you don't say anything.
But you have to have qualifications to be an critic.
Okay.
See what I'm saying?
So this is, and these areas of honesty, dishonesty, a person has to use their own judgment to know when they're taking it too far, when they're allowing dishonesty to take over their life, versus a unique situation in which I know that at this moment, honesty is going to be offensive. Honesty is going to hurt feelings. And therefore I am not going to, I'd rather not hurt any feelings. And that's,
Okay, so let me answer the question.
no problem.
We're talking about other people's being ashamed. What about you being dishonest? You're not ashamed. Meaning somebody asked you a question.
Yeah.
You answered dishonestly because you'd be ashamed if you
Yeah.
answered like.
Yeah.
truthfully.
So that's a great question. The Talmud does say elsewhere, it's not a Talmud we're going to get to, that there were 3 areas in which the sages would not necessarily answer honestly. And one of them was areas of intimacy. Like if someone posed a question to the Chacham about their intimate lives, they didn't feel the need to respond honestly, because it's an area, it's not the same, it's not necessarily about shame, but it's the same, it's similar in the sense that it's a private part of my life. And therefore, there is some degree of shame in talking about it. Therefore, I don't feel necessary to talk to you about it. And therefore, they would even be somewhat dishonest in their response. So you do see a source. Now, the difference I would say is in that situation, it may be allowed to have dishonesty. It's not an obligation. It's not a mitzvah, because if I want, I could be honest. If it's only causing shame to myself, I'm allowed to. But when it comes to someone else, it's a mitzvah. It would be a prohibition to say, to be honest if it's causing shame. When it comes to myself, I have the right maybe to be dishonest, or at the very least to deflect in order to not cause myself shame.
Rabbi, what's the definition exactly in Talmud? Definition between lie and misrepresentation of.
So we'll get to that afterwards. What is it? I don't know if the Talmud necessarily says so, because it describes what that is. Because I mean, the question is we just said is about the bride, Na'ava Chasuda, or the business transaction. Would you categorize that as an outright lie or more of a bending of the truth? I don't know. Let's read the next Gemara I want to get to. This is Tractate Yevamos. Actually, I took out a couple Gemaras that I think you can follow along. 65b. Yevamos 65b. Here the Gemara says, all right, let's start with the Gemara. We're going to start a little bit earlier, right after the Mishnah, and we're going to start with a topic which is unrelated to this. It leads into this discussion, but it's actually an interesting discussion. The Gemara says, the Mishnah said that a man is obligated in the mitzvah of Pirya Viridia, of having children, but a woman is not obligated. It's an interesting thing. There's a mitzvah to have children, but the mitzvah is only on the man. Women are not obligated in the mitzvah of having children. Says the Gemara, Yivam Samachem with base. How do we know this? How do we know that men are obligated in the mitzvah of having children and women are not? Now, technically, a man needs a woman to fulfill the obligation. So the mitzvah is going to be fulfilled with a man and a woman. But the man has the obligation. For the woman, it is what we call an optional mitzvah. Gemara says, how do we know this? Omar Rabbi Lah, Mishum, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Lah says in the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, Omar Kra. The pasuk says, Umilu es haaretz v'kivshua. When the pasuk talks about the obligation to have children, it says, Pru'ruvu, have children, umilu es haaretz, fill the earth, v'kivshuha, and conquer it. So the Gemara says, deduces, that because the Torah links having children with conquering, again, the wording that Hashem says to Adam and Chava is Pru'ruvu, have children, umilu es haaretz, fill the land, and then conquer it, v'kivshuha, conquer the land. Says the Gemara, Ish darko lichbosh. Who is it that typically conquers land? That's a man. Men are the ones which typically conquer land. Ve'ein isha darko lichbosh. It is not the way of women to go out and conquer land. You know, even till today, even with all the progress we've made in the area of equality, it is still highly uncommon. It exists, but the combat units in the armies are, generally speaking, are men.
Go to Ann Arbor.
What?
Go to Ann Arbor.
Can't get away with that in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, that's probably, armies are at.
That's right. So the combat units in the army, I think, in probably every army in the world, still are mostly men. What?
Except American.
I don't think so. The American army is different.
Oh, in Israel, a good example.
In other words, in Israel and America, there are women in the army, but the vast majority of the combat units are men. Interestingly, in Israel, there is the one section of the army which is primarily women, and that is I've heard this already a few times, that in the along some of the dangerous borders where there needs to be surveillance, constant surveillance, whether it's looking at the actual location or looking at computer screens. So what I've heard is that women are more sought after than men because their attention span is better than men.
There's actually, in a lot of professions,
It's true.
in accounting
In accounting and other areas. So it's an actual reality. So because they are able to focus and pay attention, so for those areas we need to be constantly focused, it is more the female task force that does it. But when it comes to conquest, the vast majority of soldiers in those area of battle are men till today. And therefore the Gemara said, because the pasuk, when it comes to having children, the pasuk links it to the idea of conquering. From here, we can derive that just as the conquering part of the verse is focused on men, so too the obligation to have children part of the verse is also an obligation for men. And for women, it's an optional mitzvah. What's that? For men? To have children. I believe it's seen to be the fulfillment of a mitzvah, yes. But like many mitzvahs which women can opt in, which for men is an obligation. Like sitting in the sukkah is an obligation for men. For women, it's a mitzvah opportunity. For men, it's a mitzvah obligation. So I believe the idea of having children is seen as a mitzvah for both, but as an obligation for men.
They don't get anything.
They do. It's a fulfillment of a mitzvah.
So they do.
Absolutely, they get a fulfillment. So the simple proof to that is that they make a bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. Any time-bound positive commandment, which for man is an obligation, for a woman is an optional mitzvah. Yeah.
No, you can't have one without the other.
You can't have what?
You cannot have one without the other, you gotta have both.
To have children.
Yeah.
That's a good point. And that's what he said earlier, that it is, but for a man, it's an obligation. But yes, the man would have to find a woman who is a willing partner in having a child. That should be his wife. But the point is that nevertheless, a woman is not obligated. She is not obligated to have children according to Torah. Only a man is. So yeah, it is kind of interesting because again, you do need both to produce a child, but it is only an obligation for the man, and for a woman, it's an option.
Same with sex, men are obligated to women have sex.
So we're
Saying that way?
We'll get back into the Gemara. So there you go. So the Gemara questions that. The Gemara says, Adarabba. This is, how can you say that? The word is the kivshua, and you, seemingly God is saying to both Adam and Chava should conquer the land. Tarti mashma. Amar Nachman Yisrael says no. He says the word is, if you look at the reading, it says vikavsha without the vav, which implies only one of you has to conquer the land. Hey, this is somewhat technical. Rabbi Yosef says another source to this idea that the obligation to have children is for men, and for women it is optional, an optional mitzvah. He says mehacha. I have a different source, and this is later, where God says, "Ani kel shakai, I am God." Pray urevei, have children, but pray urevei is spoken to a single person, not to two people. Below kamar pruvu, and it doesn't say pru urevu. So again, another biblical source of this idea that men are obligated, women, it is an optional mitzvah. All this is the first part of the Gemara. The second part of the Gemara is what gets into the topic that we were talking about, which is saying something, not saying something, being honest, not being honest. Sure.
Why do we need to learn to sure?
Because otherwise it seems to be an obligation to both. Pru urevu means be fruitful and multiple. What's that?
Why this word? Like, what's so special about this word?
The word kivshua, again, the way the Talmudic derivation of it is that kivshua clarifies who the obligation of having children is on. Is only on the one who is also going to then conquer the world.
So it seems to be, I mean, I'm just saying, it seems to be like the Gemara is hinting that it's a way of the men to conquer the woman.
I don't think that's what the I don't think that's certainly not the pshat of the Gemara.
No,
the Gemara doesn't say
that's
that.
why I said hinting. I didn't say. Obviously, it's not the shot, but why? would
It does
the
say
Gemara-
elsewhere in the Gemara, and this is an
Why
area
would
which
the
again I
Gemara-
don't know if today's societal norms accept, and that is that it is the way of the world that the man should seek the woman, and not the other way around. In other words, the way of the world is that the man should look for the woman. She should be the one who's seeking, and the woman should allow herself, so to say, to be found. Again, today maybe there's changes in society that's not the normal. Again, I think even till today, even with all the changes, there's still some truth. A woman wants to be taken out on a date. There's a certain truth to that, which I think remains still today by most. Anyway, so there is this that concept is mentioned in the Gemara as well. Anyway, but continuing on this, now the Gemara gets back to what we were speaking about, which is the issues of honesty and speaking, what you should say, what you shouldn't say. But Amar Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Law, Mishum Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon. This same Rabbi Law who shared the last statement said another statement. And here's what he says: Kishem shemitzvah al adam lomar davar hanishma. Just as it is a mitzvah to say something that will be heard. In other words, it's a mitzvah to rebuke. It's a mitzvah to tell the truth, to tell a person this is what you should do. By the way, this coming line is so important in today's day and age. In today's society, with what we're struggling with, if only everyone would follow this line. Just as it's a mitzvah to say something which you know will be listened to, kach mitzvah adam shelo lomar davar she'eino nishma. Sometimes it's a mitzvah not to say something if it's not going to be heard. So, in other words, just saying something because it's right, sometimes that's a mitzvah, sometimes it is a sin. If me saying it's going to help, if me saying this statement is going to clarify things, or going to help people make the right choices, then it's a mitzvah. But if I know that me saying this is not going to be heard, then it's a mitzvah not to say it. It's a mitzvah not to say something if you know there's no chance it's going to have an effect. That's what he's saying over here. As the Rabbi Abba Omer, Rabbi Abba says, Chova, it is an obligation not to speak when your words are not going to be listened to. Sometimes you have someone in front of you, you know they're doing something wrong. And every fiber of your being, even your godly soul, your sense of righteousness says, I got to yell at this person. I got to tell them what they're doing is wrong. He says it is an obligation to keep silent. Shenemar, as the pasuk says in Mishlei, Proverbs, chapter 9, Al tochach letz, don't rebuke a fool. If it's a fool, don't bother rebuking him. It is forbidden to rebuke a fool. Pen yisna echa.
Hold on a second. You're in court,
and you have some people making statements.
In court is different. In court, everyone knows you have to clarify. But in a general situation, then you know that your words are going to be heard, maybe not by that person, but heard by the judge, heard by the jury. But if your statement is only there to say the truth, I need to say the truth. The truth needs to be heard. But right now, that truth is not going to be heard. Then it's an obligation not to say it. Don't rebuke a fool. Pen yisna'echa, because all it's going to lead to is hate. All this statement is going to lead is that they're going to hate you. They're not ready to listen to you. They're not ready to follow your advice. They're just going to dislike you. They're going to lead to hate.
No, they hate you anyway because you're not done.
So then don't say it if all it leads to is hate. Instead, says Mishlei, hocheach l'chacham, rebuke a wise person. V'yehavechan, he's going to love you. And the question we have now, many of us are thinking, I know exactly. I know I need to. I know when I'm going to rebuke the person who's going to listen to me, and I know when I shouldn't rebuke the person who's not going to listen to me. But how about we turn around a little bit? Am I the type of person who can hear rebuke? Many of us, when we hear this, we're simply thinking, when should I say something? When should I not say something? What type of person am I when it comes to listening? Am I the fool who, when I am rebuked, I simply lash out at the person who talks to me? Or am I the wise person who Shlomo says that when someone rebukes me, I love them because of their rebuke? Not I love them even though they rebuke me. That's not what he's saying. It's not that I love them even though they said something to me. No, I love them because of the rebuke. Because I see the truth in what they're saying, and I see that how do I become a better person? How do I become a better person, a wiser person? How am I going to make right choices? Only if I listen to people's rebuke. So this pasuk in Mishlei, it's both ways. You have to think about it from the terms of when you have something to share. And remember, share it only if you know this person is wise enough to listen to you. And if this person is not, and we know many situations you're talking to someone or something, and you know this person has shut down the conversation. In their mind, this is a done deal. There's no point. There's really no point. In fact, there's an obligation not to say something. Or a person who knows a chacham, who you know, and I'm going to share, they're gonna appreciate it because they may actually listen to the new perspective. But that's only one half of it. The other half of it is how am I as a listener? Am I the late, the fool that Shlomo describes? Am I the chacham who loves rebuke, who loves the person who rebukes? That's the next statement of Rabbi. Let's move on to the next statement of Rabbi Yelah. So we have the first statement of Rabbi Yelah had to do with the obligation of having children. Second statement of Rabbi Yelah had to do with the obligation of not talking when my talking is not going to be helpful, even if it's true, and even if it's right, even if it's righteous, and even if it's holy, even if it's Torah, doesn't matter. Rabbi Yelah said in the name of Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon, the same Rabbi Yelah saying in the name of the same person, Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, who was the son of Yochai, Shimon bar Yochai. Muter lo l'adam l'shanos b'dvar hashalom. A person is allowed to be dishonest for the sake of peace. So this is something we've kind of been saying throughout. The first example we gave from the other Talmud was you're allowed to lie for the sake of avoiding shame. Now you're allowed to be, and the wording over here is, because Boris, I think you brought this up, which is, it doesn't say you're allowed to lie.
Misrepresentation of
Mutulo, that would be mutulo l'shakir. The wording would be you're allowed to lie. The Gemara doesn't avoid saying you're allowed to lie. The wording is mutulo l'shanos. L'shanos means to change. That you can change the truth a little bit. Bend the truth for the sake of shalom, for the sake of peace. And what's the source? Interesting. It's not a source that most people think of in the Torah. We think, some people think of Adam, of God speaking to Abraham, of the story of Yaakov. It's actually at the very end of the book of Bereshis. The final scene, so to say, before Yosef dies, is the brothers approaching Yosef. This is after their father died, after Yaakov died. So at this point, they've been living in Egypt for a little while, but now Yaakov dies. And now they're worried. Maybe the only reason why Yosef was so friendly to them for the last however many years, 22 years. Maybe the only reason that he's been so friendly to them, why did I say that? 17 years. That for the last 17 years is because his father was alive. And Yosef loves his father. Maybe out of respect for his father, he was being nice to the tribes, the brothers. But now the father died, so now they're nervous. So what do they say? This is Bereshis chapter 50. They say, Avicha tziva. They come to Yosef and And they say, your father, our father, but your father commanded, saying, Ko somru, this is what you should tell Yosef, Sana, forgive them for their sin. Now, we never find such a correspondence between Yaakov and his sons. We never find Yaakov telling his sons, tell Yosef to forgive you. So the Gemara is assuming that that conversation never happened. And yet the Torah accepts it. The Torah says this is what they said, which is giving us a leading by example that we're supposed to do this. So here they did so to protect the peace between themselves and their brother Yosef. So they made up a story. They fabricated a story that your father said. Their father never told them to tell this to Yosef. They said, your father, our father told us, tell Yosef to forgive you. Yosef then says, you don't have to worry. I forgave you then, I forgive you now. So that is the first opinion of the Gemara. The Gemara then continues, Rav Nassan Omer, mitzvah. Nassan says it's a mitzvah, it's an obligation to lie for the sake of shalom. Not only is it okay to lie for the sake of peace, it's an obligation to lie for the sake of peace. It's a mitzvah. Shenamar, he quotes from a different source, the story of Shmuel, Vayomer Shmuel, Eich Elech, how can I go? V'shama Shaul v'hargeni. And Shaul will hear, and he will kill me.
According to that, I'm gonna ask you a question. According to that, Yosef made a vera.
What's that?
According to that, Yosef made an avera.
Why? How did
When he
Yosef do an
told
affair?
Yaakov about his dreams, when he told his father about his dream,
Yeah,
the first time, whatever, second time, he knows he's gonna piss off his brothers.
right. Okay, so that's a separate question. How he did that? It's not a question what he said. The question is right. Anyways, he says from Nassim brings a quote from the story of Shmuel, in which Shmuel says something, and then God commands. Shmuel says, "How can I go?" And I believe the context of this is as follows: God tells Shmuel to go anoint David HaMelech. I believe that's the context here. Go anoint the next king. So Shmuel says to God, the prophet Samuel says to God, if Shaul, the current king, hears that I'm anointing a future king, it's not even his son, he's going to kill me. So God then advises Shmuel and says, Eglas bakar tikach b'yedecha, take in your hands a calf and tell him that you're going to sacrifice, to bring a sacrifice. So you see, God instructed Shmuel to lie in order to preserve the peace between Shaul and the prophet Shmuel. This is what greater source do you need? Here you have God literally instructing someone to lie for the sake of shalom. So from here he says, not only is it okay to lie for the sake of shalom, it is a mitzvah. It can be an obligation to lie for the sake of shalom. And finally, the Gemara concludes, and this is something which was referenced earlier, Devei Rabbi Yishmael, and the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael Tana, they taught, Gadol HaShalom, shalom is so great, Sha'afa Kadosh Baruch Hu Shinaba, because even God deviated for the sake of truth. Was again the key word over here is Shina, which means change, not lie, but change. Sha'afa Kadosh Baruch Hu Shinaba, God changed the truth to be correct, because when Sarah was talking to herself, when she heard she would have a child, Sarah said, how can I have a child? My husband is old. And then when God repeated Sarah's thoughts to Abraham, he changed it and said that your wife said, how can she have a child when she is old? So you see, God changed what she actually said, which was somewhat offensive to him, to something that she said, which would sound more offensive to herself. And therefore preserve the peace between Abraham and Sarah. So basically, what we see over here from the different Gemaras we brought. Firstly, just to kind of wrap everything up. First is the Torah has a pretty strict approach when it comes to honesty. You have to be honest. There's no such thing as a harmless lie. Every lie has harmful nature to it because your lie is something which is against the essence of God. God is truth. Hashem Elokecha Emes. We say at the end of the Shema. So the first point to remember is that there's no such thing as a harmless lie. However, the question is so every lie we establish is harmful. So now the question is when the lie is harmful, but the truth is also harmful. That's the question. That's how we have to phrase the question. It's not a harmless lie. It's a harmful lie. Harmful lie and harmful truth. Which do you choose from? So here we have the sages say it is okay to choose the first opinion. This is the difference. The first opinion says it is okay to choose the harmful lie over the harmful truth. The second opinion says you're obligated to choose the harmful lie over the harmful truth. Because if it's going to break up the peace between people, like, for example, Yosef and his brothers, or like, for example, most people think shalom bayis, husband and wife. No, the example is not husbands and wife. It's two brothers, or a king and a prophet. So better to do something wrong, but it's not going to break up the peace. And the other example from the previous Gemara is better to do the harmful lie better than the harmful truth, which causes shame to a bride and groom. And so those are generally the two areas where the Torah would say better to be dishonest is if honesty is either going to break up the peace between people or cause great shame to people, then dishonesty may be the way to go. But if it comes to being dishonest just because I'll make a lot of money, or dishonest because I'll feel better about it, that there's no leniency. And this is how the Gemara concludes. Yeah.
Question on that. So let's say you're driving down the road, you see the spouse